Periodically Productions presents Fairy Tales for Unwanted Children. Princesses. Written and read by Scott Thrower. Once there was a prince of a marriageable age who sent his knights out into the world to find him a wife. When 9 princesses were brought to the castle, he took them to a tower where they found a room with nothing but a spinning wheel and a mountain of straw. "The princess who weaves this straw into gold by morning will be happily wed before the first snow falls," said the prince, locking the heavy tower door with a key that hung from a chain around his neck. He then went to a great feast and forgot all about the women until morning. When he unlocked the door after breakfast and climbed the stairs, the women in the straw were gone, and all that remained was a scrap of pale blue silk caught on the frame of the window and some loose threads from a golden rope. The prince picked up some metal strands and rolled them through his fingers as his fury rose, and moments later he yelled for his knights to bring the women back. That night, he stood in front of 7 princesses, for 2 of them could not be found. The women clustered together against tall hedges, cold in their soiled silk gowns, and the prince's men encircled them. 6 of the princesses had the decency to cower, but the 7th, a brown-haired wildling in a pale blue dress, met the prince's gaze until he had no choice but to look away. "The first princess to escape the maze will be happily wed before the first snow falls," said the prince. A cheer rose up from the assembled crowd, a jovial lot in noble finery, each anticipating the grandeur of a royal ball. But as the energy of the crowd crashed against the princesses, they were as still and silent as stones. The princess in the pale blue dress continued to meet the prince's gaze, and she did not look away as the crowd's cheers began to sputter and fail. "The remaining princesses will be imprisoned," the prince said finally, tearing his eyes free and rounding on his heel to angrily stalk away. The cheering crowd fell silent, and the castle echoed with the prince's heels against the cobbles. At last the princesses turned and entered the maze as the knights prodded them on. But by morning not a one of them emerged. When the sun finally reached its highest point, the prince sent his knights in to rescue the women. He'd barely touched his lunch, surprised that the maze had bested all 7. But when the knights returned, it was to report another escape. Soon the prince was guided to a princess-sized hole torn into the thorny edge of the maze, still dripping royal blood onto the gravel. The prince stood in disbelief until his eyes settled on a neatly folded scrap of pale blue silk, sitting on the path the women had forged into the forest beyond. The prince's anger was a storm across the kingdom, and many felt the burn of his wrath. Scullery maids ran as he approached, and nobles invited for dinner did not take their eyes off their soup for risk of drawing his eye. When the battered knights rode out in search of princesses, they passed under the dangling feet of the castle gardeners, who hung limply from the outer walls. That day, only 3 princesses could be found, and these 3 were dragged to the deepest depths of the castle, where they found a large door of steel and stone that was only ever spoken of in hushed whispers when children were asleep and the fire burned low. 2 of the women had screamed as they went, begging for help from any they could with tears on their cheeks and desperate hands. But the 3rd, the wildling princess in the pale blue dress, was silent and focused. And many she'd passed turned away for fear that she would remember them when all of this was done. The prince met with them in a long, narrow room near the storied door, and for a moment he faltered when the room rang with the roar of the beast trapped within. He stood behind his knights and tapped their shoulders, and they presented 2 of the princesses with silvery swords of steel and gold. But when a knight approached the princess in the pale blue dress, she was offered nothing. The prince motioned to the door as he leaned around the shoulder of the broadest knight, smiling widely and meeting the gaze of the wildling princess. "This should have been so easy," he said quietly. This could have been a story we told our children, and they told theirs. There is a beast in the castle, my princesses, and should any of you slay it, we shall be happily wed before the first snow falls." The princess in the pale blue dress laughed and opened her mouth to speak, but the prince flicked a hand towards her and a night knocked the air from her lungs. She fell to her knees, further ripping the dress that was barely even blue after the last 2 trials. But her beautiful, defiant eyes flashed towards the prince one last time as the women were forced through the heavy door and into the darkness beyond. A princess screamed, and the beast shook the castle's roots with its roaring reply. The prince looked nervously at the door of stone and steel, before patting a knight on the shoulder and smiling. "If one should survive, bring her to the feast and we shall toast to the marriage. But I must say we won't expect you." And then he turned and began the long, wheezing climb to meet his guests above, certain that his meal would go uninterrupted. Long tables had been set out and bore the weight of a dozen pigs, vats of vegetables, and countless pheasants. Guests dripped sweat as the fires burned high, safe from the grey and cold outside. Servants bustled through the crowd with wine and ale, and as the cups were emptied and filled, the noise of the crowd buried the roars of the beast below. People still looked anxiously towards the prince, but as his cup was drained and drained again, his dark mood was drowned. By the 6th course, he again dispatched his knights in search of love, and raised his chalice to toast the prospect of a royal wedding. But he lowered his drink as a hush filled the room, and he looked across the crowd to see 3 women standing in the far-off doors. A princess in yellow limped heavily, clutching at a wound in her side. A princess in green seemed ready to faint as she held the remains of her dress together. And behind them walked the princess in pale blue, trailing the tip of her sword against the stone floor as she dragged the bloodied head of the beast behind her. The crowd exploded into celebration, and the prince nearly buckled as his father slapped him on the back. Glasses and cheers were raised, and the crash of the noise was deafening. The prince could not hear it, though, because he'd caught the lovely eyes of the princess in blue, and this time she would not let him look away. Far across the room she raised her red-stained sword, and she held it aloft until silence fell. She let go of the beast's head and began to walk towards the prince as the crowd split between them. "I wove your straw into gold and left you, but you didn't let us go," she said, stepping over discarded flagons and bones. "I escaped your maze, and we went away. But still, you didn't let us go." The silence grew chilly despite the fires, and all eyes went to the floor. No one wanted to meet the prince's eyes, as each had seen what would happen when his rage bubbled over. They waited for the explosion, for the knights to be called, and each wondered how many bodies would hang from the castle walls by morning. "I have killed the animal in your dungeon," the princess in pale blue continued, as her sword rang against the rough stone floor. "But now I'll happily kill the beast before the first snow falls." She began to run towards him, and the prince stumbled back. He called out for his knights, but they'd been sent away. He looked to his parents, but they had wisely already run. Finally, he looked to his crowd of nobles, but they would not meet his gaze. In fact, they all looked upon the princess in the pale blue dress, and they continued to part for her as she ran barefoot through the center of the room, raising the bloody sword aloft. And then, as one, they began to cheer. Did you find a moral for this week's story? Let us know on Twitter at periodicallypod, or join the Fairy Tales for Unwanted discussion group on Facebook. For more fairy tales for unwanted children, join us at unwantedchildren.ca.